Every year, we set out on epic quests to level up our health stats, unlock the secret to saving money, or equip ourselves to be the ultimate partner. But too often, by February, we're stuck respawning in the same old routine. This is the year to find the timeless strategies for lasting transformation. Let's level up.
Good morning. You came out on a rainy day. Look at you go, right? I mean, now that rain is a once-in-a-generation event here in Southern California, I'm surprised you had the gall to do it. Well done. We're in week 4 of Level Up, and today we're talking about leveling up our rest. We've looked at habits, we've looked at parenting, we're talking about rest today, and we'll get to that in just a moment. I want to let you know that starting next week, we've got a new series that's called Joyful Jesus. We're going to look at some of the gospel stories about Jesus and about how he just exuded this joy and this humor wherever he went. He was very crafty, very cunning, and whether you've been a Christian for a really long time or if you just consider yourself like Christ curious, this is a great series for you to jump in on because we're going to be putting a lens over some of these stories that maybe you haven't seen before. I think what it'll do is it'll teach us a lot about the very heart of God, and it'll teach us about, I think, the way that we can live and move and be in the world. So I hope you'll join us next Sunday as we start our new series, Joyful Jesus. This week, Level Up, we're going to talk about next level rest. Next level rest. When I was in my late 20s, I was pastoring a church plant. A church plant is just a church startup, so it was a brand new church in Springfield, Missouri. I was the only staff member there, and it was a whole lot of work, and not a ton of pay because, as you can imagine, for a brand new church, there wasn't really much of a budget. And so, in addition to that, I was full-time working at a graphic and web design firm, and so I was doing both of those things. And I was spending about 40 hours a week or so at the graphic and web design firm, and about 40 hours a week or so at the church plant. And so, most of my weeks were between 70 and 85 hours of working. Now, I didn't have kids at the time, which is good because I learned later in life that kids they're a huge time suck, you know. And so it's good I didn't have that at the time. My wife at the time was both working as a waitress at Olive Garden and also going to nursing school. And so both of us were just really exhausted all of the time. And I sat down, some friends invited me to lunch, Stephen and Stephanie Walters, and they sat down because they were concerned about me. And so we sat at lunch, and Stephanie looked at me and she said, "Josh, how you doing?" And I said the thing to her that I've been saying to lots of people, which is like, "Oh, I'm good, staying really busy, I'm really busy, I'm good, but just, busy." And I used the word busy 42 times in 30 seconds or something. And I was wearing how busy I was, almost like a badge of honor. It's not how I really thought of it, but when I would talk to people about how busy I was, and they were telling me that they were only working 40 or 50 or 60 hours a week, I was like, nice try, right? I just I didn't think this at the top of my head, but deep down in the recesses of my heart, I believed that I was better than you because I worked so much more than you. And so working that much was becoming a part of the way I perceived myself, a part of my identity. And Stephanie looked at me and she says, "How many hours a week are you working right now?" And I said, probably 70 to 85, depending on the week. And she said, "Well, you look terrible." And I said, "Well, thanks." She said, "How are you even staying awake and working that much?" And I said, "Well, 5-hour energy." And it was true. I was drinking so much 5-hour energy at that point that I had started to enjoy the flavor. You have a real problem if you enjoy the flavor of 5-hour energy. It is objectively disgusting. But I had built up a taste to it. And so she looked at me and she said, how's your marriage? Are you seeing Emily enough? I'm like, "Well, we're both busy and we connect when we can," and just this kind of thing. And then finally she looked at me, and in my exhaustion, she just said, "Hey, Josh, I just want you to know, while you're doing a lot of good work, and we're really grateful for all that you do, when I sit with you now and talk to you, it feels like you're a husk of yourself. And I just want you to know you don't have to live like this." So I said, "Well, I appreciate the concern. That's really kind of you. But actually, money's pretty tight, and I do have to do these work. And I've got all these clients and these projects built up, and I've got due dates, and the church is in this place, and I've got to help these people over here. And I'm trying to build these relationships here, and I'm trying to help this family over here." And I just went on. And the more I talked, the more she just kept looking at me and saying, "You don't have to live like this. You don't have to live like this." And so we were just verbally fighting each other back and forth while ignoring one another simultaneously. And finally, her husband, Stephen, just put his hand up. He's like, "Hey, Josh." And so we both stopped, and he looked at me, and he said, "I don't really even know the words that are coming out of your mouth right now, but really no matter what you say, I just want you to know that she's going to say, you don't have to live like this." And he was right. But more importantly, she was right. I didn't have to live like that. I was making choices based on what I thought was best, based on the kind of person I wanted to be known as, based on the kind of accomplishments I wanted to have in my life. I was making choices to live in a completely unsustainable way. And in doing so, I was robbing the people around me, the people who mattered most, of my presence. And a lot of us make those kinds of choices all the time because we live in a culture that's addicted to work, success, achievement, and money. And look, there's nothing in the scripture that would say that success, achievement, or money in and of themselves are inherently bad. Not inherently bad. But when we turn good things into ultimate things, that's what the Bible calls idolatry. And for many of us, we've made good things, success, achievement, money, into ultimate things, and our life has revolved around them. A few years ago, Arthur C. Brooks released a book called From Strength to Strength. And it was about how in your second half of life, after the age of 40, you could start moving from seeing your primary function in the world to be doing and accomplishing, and moving toward pouring into future generations. So that even as you got older and you retired from your job, you still had a great value in the world, but it wasn't so much in making yourself famous or well-known or successful as much as helping others along their journey. And he interviewed this woman for this book, and she was a top Wall Street executive and had been worked on Wall Street for decades. And she was talking about all the success that she'd had in her work, and he asked her if she was happy, and without missing a beat, she said no. He said, well, why are you not happy? And she said, well, my marriage is basically in tatters. My husband and I barely speak to each other. My grown adult kids don't ever call and don't ever speak to me because I wasn't there when they were growing up very much, and so they're resentful about that. And I just really don't have the time to reach out and try to patch those relationships up. I've got some hobbies and interests that I probably would find some life in, and I'd love to do some traveling, but I just don't have time because I'm working so many hours. And so Arthur said to her, okay, but wouldn't it make more sense then for your own sense of joy and happiness and fulfillment to work less hours at the job you've been doing for decades and to use some of that extra time to invest in your marriage that's crumbling and in your kids who won't speak to you and these hobbies and this traveling? Wouldn't that make sense? Wouldn't that make you happier? And she said, yes. And he said, then why don't you do it? And she said, maybe I would prefer to be special rather than happy. And his mouth just gaped open. And she said, no, I can see that hits you wrong. She said, but here's the thing. I think anybody could be happy. Any old loser could be happy. Just spend more time with your friends and family and doing leisure activities. That'd probably make most people happy. Most people can't do what I do. Most people can't be special. Anybody can be happy. And I believe that a narrative that has pervaded our culture is that it is better to be special, to accumulate achievement and wealth and fame than it is to be happy. And some of the wealthiest and most famous and most successful people are some of the most miserable. But we'd rather be special than be happy. But what God has called us into is a joy that supersedes, I believe, both happiness and success. But that involves resting in Him in an ancient tradition called Sabbath, that God prescribed not just for our own well-being, but for even the way that we conceive and perceive of ourselves and our place in the world. And so today, we're going to talk a little bit about next level rest, and specifically, we're going to talk about the ancient practice of Sabbath. There are lots of books on Sabbath. There are lots of books that would give you kind of the blocking and tackling, but today I want to primarily focus on why. Why do you need rest? Why do you need Sabbath? But before we get to that, before we get to what Jesus, I believe, has invited us into, I want to talk a little bit about why we are so out of control with our relationship to work here in the United States. In the West generally, but in the United States specifically. So I want to begin by talking about 4 cultural trends that have very much fed our relationship to work here in the United States. And here's the first one. The first one is income disparity. There's greater income disparity between the top earners in this country and the bottom earners in this country than there is in any other Western country in the world, and it's not even close. And in fact, over the last several decades, it's gotten worse and worse. Here's a chart that just shows how much annual wage increase different sectors of the world have seen. So that blue line, that light blue line on the bottom there is the bottom 90% of everybody in the United States. So from 1980 until 2020, everybody in the US, regardless of their kind of which strata they fit into when it comes to wealth, everybody in the US increased their real wages, even adjusted for inflation. Like in 1980, you made less than you made in 2020 working the same job. Everybody increased it. But while the bottom 90% increased 26% over those decades, the top 1% increased 160% over those decades. And then inequality between the top and the bottom just continued to open up and open up and open up. It was the case a long time ago here in the United States that the CEO of a major corporation would make a lot more than the average employee. But a few decades ago, they were making about 20 times what the average employee made. Today, they're making almost 400 times what the average employee makes. And this is a chart showing going back to 1965. You can see that by 2021, it was 398.8 times they were making over and against their average employee. Now, the point of this message is not that we all need to pick up pitchforks and torches and go storm the streets, okay? That's not where I'm going with this, in case you're worried about this. My point is simply this. If you are a board of a company, if you are a shareholder of a corporation, and you're paying your senior lead team, your chief executive officer, 400 times what the average employee makes at your company, you are expecting a massive return on that investment. You're expecting that person to work very hard. You're expecting them to burn the midnight oil. You're expecting them to burn the candle on both ends. Isn't it interesting that all of our metaphors about working hard have to do with flames? And so you're expecting them to just basically burn themselves to a crisp. Why? Because if they won't do it, there are a line of people out the door who will. Get in there and work. And then our corporate culture is set by who? Well, the people at the top. Because culture in a company, in an organization, culture is what you tolerate and what you celebrate. And at the highest levels of our companies here in the US, what is celebrated is working ridiculous amounts of hours. That's how you get into the C-suite. That's how you get the corner office. That's how you work your way up the ladder. It starts with the CEO, but it absolutely trickles down from there. And so we have this hustle culture that starts at the top, and that is in large part due to the income disparity, and it's making everybody have to work crazier hours. Another trend that's happening in our culture is the technology trend. And you would think that when it comes to technology, the better our technology would get, the less work, the less hours we'd have to put in. But here's what's fascinating about technology over the last several decades. The technological revolution over the last several decades has meant that we can work not less hours, but we can work from anywhere, which means there's increasingly very little separation between our work life on the one hand and our home life on the other. For many of us, most of us probably here in this room, if you're employed, you can probably get messages, text messages, Slack messages, Facebook messages, Instagram messages, TikTok for now, maybe not. I don't know what we're doing there. Okay, so you can get all kinds of messages at all times of the day, no matter where in the world you are. And so what we've seen is that people then feel like they're always connected and therefore their team is always dependent on them, which means over the last several years, we're starting to use less and less vacation time here in the United States as a society. Why? Because we think, because we have unlimited availability, we must be indispensable. Because they can always get a hold of me, I'm always available, I must be indispensable. And so we start to believe, right? And it's not like at the top of our conscience, but deep down in the recesses of our mind, we start to believe that it would be bad to take time away. That it would be a burden for the team to take time away. That we're so important, we can't possibly take time away. And so our technology, far from giving us the opportunity to work less, has actually driven a mindset that's caused us to work more. Every year, the internet company Expedia Travel does a survey of vacation time in countries all around the world. And they ask people how many vacation hours they're given, paid vacation hours they're given by their companies, and how many they take. Now, let me just name right up top. Expedia has a vested interest in people getting more vacation time all around the world so that they can use Expedia, right? Okay, so there's definitely, it's true that there's a little bit of a cross-interest there. And yet, here's the findings of their report from 2023. So on the left side, the numbers is how many days of vacation people use on average in a particular country. And on the right side is how many paid vacation days they're allotted. In Japan, they're allotted 22 days on average, and they use 26. I don't know how that works out. They've got something figured out over there that we need to figure out, okay? So that's Japan. I just want you to look at the United States. On average, We're allotted 12.5, far less than almost every Western country in the world. And we don't even take what we're given. On average, we take 11 days, compared to Hong Kong's 25, and Germany's 24, and New Zealand's 21, and Australia's 18. We take less vacation time than almost every country in the world. Why is that? Well, we've convinced ourselves that because we're available, we must be indispensable. So we just won't unplug. We won't take the time. A third trend that we're seeing is in the United States and everywhere in the West, but especially in the United States, our meaning and our purpose are tied to our work. You know, in societies before the Industrial Revolution, people didn't see their meaning and purpose primarily as tied to their job. They saw their meaning and purpose oftentimes as tied to their family or tied to their friends or tied to their communities. And it was then, how can I support my family? How can I use my strength on behalf of those who don't have strength of their own? How can I be a pillar in this community so that when others need something, I am there for them? That's how people saw their meaning and how people saw their purpose. But increasingly, here in the US especially, we're starting to feel like, what's your purpose in life? What's your meaning in life? And that's all about looking into your heart and deciding what you want to do when you get older. It's why we ask 4-year-olds, what do you want to be when you grow up? My 4-year-old wanted to be a Bigfoot hunter when he grew up. I was like, great, you're never moving out of the house, are you? All right, so immediately we want to know that because for us, that's where real purpose, real meaning is found. So we want to know it from the very beginning. So there's so much pressure when students then go to college because they know that the way that this society looks at them will largely be dependent on their earning potential, on their accomplishments, on the line of work they choose. It's why I was talking a few months ago to a man, he is 70 years old. He's retirement age, and his wife would really like for him to be retired, and his grown kids would really like for him to be retired, and he's financially fully stable and could be retired, and he just recently took a job working 50-plus hours a week. And I asked him, why are you, does anyone want this for you? I do. But why are you doing this? Well, if I'm not working, I just don't feel like I have any meaning or purpose in my life. It's a complete inability to find meaning and purpose somewhere other than output, because that's the message he's always explicitly and implicitly taken in this country. Your worth is tied to your output. In a book called Rest by Alex Sujong Kim Peng, he says this: when we define ourselves by our work, by our dedication and effectiveness and willingness to go the extra mile, then it's easy to see rest as the negation of all those things. Listen to this last line. If your work is yourself, when you cease to work, you cease to exist. If your work is yourself, when you cease to work, you cease to exist. Why do you think it is that all these billionaires all over the world who could stop working right now and never work another day in their life and totally live a life of luxury, not just for them, but for generations of children after them, even screw-ups, they got enough money for screw-ups to even live off this wealth. They don't do it because it's not about the money. It's about the success, the accomplishment, the self-perception, the perception that they want other people to have of them. It's not about the money. This is why, and I don't know if you realize this, but I looked this up beforehand. Fact, the average age of a person serving in Congress is 117 years old. That's the average. I was surprised. It's even older than I thought. Look it up, though. Totally a fact. Why is it that we have people serving in elected office in the United States who will not let go of political power until you literally pry it from their cold, dead hands? Because it's not about the money. It's about the power. It's about the way you're viewed. It's about your identity. And we think we just got to keep going and going and going. Maybe finally, when I'm 89, I'll have achieved everything I want to achieve in the Senate. Spoiler alert, no, you won't. Arthur C. Brooks, in his book From Strength to Strength, he says, what workaholics truly crave isn't work per se, it's success. They kill themselves working for money, power, and prestige. Why? Because these are forms of approval, applause, compliments, which, like all addictive things from cocaine to social media, stimulate the neurotransmitter dopamine. We get a high off of our success. We get a high off of being perceived as successful, and for many of us, we chase that high for the rest of our lives. I've heard a few interviews with former Congress people who would say, you know what people really love about serving in the Congress? They love being called congressman or congresswoman. You know what people love about serving in the Senate? They love being called senator. It's very hard to let go of some of these things. And so when your work starts to become your meaning and your purpose, it's really hard to take a break from it, because breaking from your work is breaking from yourself. Your identity is too wrapped up in it. A fourth trend in our culture is that we've got a weakened social structure right now. In other words, a part of what helps you remember that you are more than your output is your interaction with other people. It's having friends and family members and people to hang out with. Like, we all need that. And I know some of you are like, not me, Josh, I'm an introvert. I hate people. I know that. I get it. Some of you feel that way. Here's what study after study shows, by the way. Even you introverts, and I won't have you stand up. I know you'd rather die than stand up right now. Even you introverts, though, in the crowd. By the way, extroverts. Can extroverts raise your hands? Extroverts? Yeah. See, introverts, now we know where you are, too. See, this is the trick I played on you. Even introverts need people. They need people. They need time with people, because all of us need to remember that we are human beings and not human doings. Like, we all need that, and this is going to pop. There's an article that came out in The Atlantic this month by Derek Thompson. Whether you subscribe to The Atlantic or not, you should get a hold of this article. We're going to try to post a version of this on our website, I believe, this week. But the article is called The Antisocial Century. It is about how unsocial we've become as a society. He has no solutions in this thing and all problems. It is the most depressing read ever, and you should read it anyway. This is what he says. In the 1970s, the typical household entertained more than once a month. That's just having people over, having dinner, dancing in the living room, whatever they did in the 40s. But from the late 1970s to the late 1990s, the frequency of hosting friends for parties, games, dinners, and so on declined by 45%. And then 20 years after Bowling Alone was published, which was in the late 90s, early 2000s, the average amount of time that Americans spent hosting or attending social events declined another 32%. They've got charts in this article all over the place. I won't go in depth into them, but this is just the percent decline in face-to-face socializing since 2003, so in the last 20 years, basically. And it goes by age group. But so see, those little details, and you can't see all the names, and that's okay. But what the whole point is that in every age group, there's been a huge drop-off in social interaction in the last 20 years. Or this one. This is about teenagers, seniors in high school. How many of you, essentially, hang out with friends more than twice a week? Just in 1980, it was almost 90% hung out with friends over twice a week. Today, it's closer to 55, 56, 57%. It's dropped off a huge amount in just the last generation. Time spent at home. It's just a bar graph of time spent at home. Look at that huge spike in 2020. Notice that it doesn't go down much in the next several years. What happened? We got used to being by ourselves. Here's what's fascinating. We got used to being by ourselves, and then some of us got social anxiety about going out with other people. And here's what psychologists have learned. The more you keep to yourself, the greater your social anxiety is. And so it becomes a defeating loop. You're anxious about hanging out with people, so you don't hang out with people. And because you don't hang out with people, you become more anxious about hanging out with people. And because now you're even more anxious about hanging out with people, you don't hang out with people. And because you don't hang out with people, you become more anxious and hanging out with people. I hope you're enjoying this. It's just the next 30 minutes. It's just this over and over and over again. So you don't hang out with people. No, I'm not going to do this. But you get it, right? So we got used to being by ourselves, and then we just never jumped back in. I get it. People are a huge hassle. They're a huge hassle, right? You might hang out with somebody who has a different political opinion than you. Oh, rip my clothes. I can't believe it. You might have to go to a restaurant with somebody who has a food allergy or doesn't eat meat. You're like, what? How could I even do that? I only eat at Arby's. You're the weird one in that friendship, by the way, okay? We have the meats. We stopped hanging out for understandable reasons in 2020. It got way worse than it had already been increasing right over the years. But we've not gotten back into it. And here's the challenge with all of this, right? The more time we spend in isolation, the less time we spend with people, the less time we spend resting, the more we continue to start to believe that we are defined by our output, because that's almost all that's left. A friend of mine a few years ago took a job, and it was going to be a lot of nights, but he knew if he could do that for a couple of years, then his workload would decrease, and he'd get through the worst of it, and he'd be able to give his family back time. And so his wife and he agreed to do that, and she would pick up more around the house. And so they had a daughter then, a couple years into the job, and his Work was supposed to be ramping down, but it didn't. 2 years, then went 2.5, and 3, and then 3.5, and then 4. At year 4, they had this table by the front door, and he would leave his car keys on the table. And so anytime he would leave to go to his night meetings, which was almost every night, he would come home and have a quick meal with his wife and his little daughter, and then he would grab his keys and he would head out for work again. One night, he does that. He grabs his keys, he leaves, he comes back a little after 9 o'clock, and typically his 2-year-old daughter's in bed by then, and his wife is either getting ready for bed or already in bed. But that night, he walks into the living room after getting home, and his daughter is playing on the floor in the living room, and his wife is just sitting in a chair and just kind of staring off into space. He says, "Babe, what's wrong? What's going on?" And she looks up and she says, "I need to show you something." And he said, "Okay." So she picks up their little daughter, and she carries her to the front door and sets her down in front of the table with the keys on it, and she looks at her husband and she says, "Hey, I want you to pick up the keys from the table." And so he goes and he picks the keys up, and his daughter starts crying immediately. And she says, "Can you set them down?" And he sets them down, and his daughter stops. And she says, "Pick them up again." And he picks them up, and she starts crying immediately. And she says, "Set them down." And he sets them down, and she stops. And she said, "Your daughter misses you so much that she's learned that the sound of you picking your keys up is the sound of you abandoning us. And it breaks her heart every time you do it." A couple weeks later, he quit his job because he realized he wasn't in a line of work that allowed him to remember that he's a human being. That part of his responsibility in life is caring for this wife and this daughter, resting. He's not a human being. He is not his output. Jesus invited us into this ancient practice of Sabbath, of rest, of setting a day a week apart to remember that God is God, and just as importantly, that we are not. That God is indispensable, and just as importantly, we are not. That God loves us infinitely, but also that the world will go on without us. It's a humbling of oneself, a reminder. God gave this command to the ancient Israelites in the book of Exodus after he'd rescued them from slavery in Egypt, and he told them to spend one day a week, dedicate that day to the Lord, because you were once slaves and you are no longer. In other words, you used to be slaves in Egypt and you had to work every single day, and every day was like the day before, but now you are mine. You are out of Egypt. You are no longer a slave, and I love you for more than your output. And one day a week, I need you to take that day and not output anything so that you can remember that you are loved by me infinitely and has nothing to do with what you produce. I'm God. You're not. And so, over the years, the Israelites developed all kinds of practices to make sure that one day a week they dedicated it to God. They took that day off, and they did not work. And so there were all kinds of rules and regulations. By the time we got to the first century, the rabbis had interpreted all of these things very strictly. The Pharisees especially, who were very religious people in the first century, seen as leaders, and they were very literalistic about both the Old Testament commands, the Hebrew Bible, and also about the ways the rabbis had interpreted them. And then Jesus comes along, and a Sabbath day comes, a day of rest where you're not supposed to work, but the Pharisees see that Jesus isn't following all the rules of the Sabbath. And they get upset. So in Luke, in chapter 6 and verse 1, we read this: "One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples broke off heads of grain, rubbed off the husks in their hands, and ate the grain. But some Pharisees said, 'Why are you breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?'" And here's the thing. The disciples, if you've read much about them, are a bit dopey. And in this particular passage, they're just pretty hungry. They've been walking around, and so they see some grains. It'd be like if you walked around and there were just Skittles everywhere, right? And you were just like, "Oh, I'm just going to take some Skittles." They're doing the same things, but with the grain. And the Pharisees are like, "But that's working. You're harvesting." They're like, "We're snacking." "No, but you're harvesting. You're breaking one of the rules." And so Jesus replies to them. Jesus says, "Haven't you read in the scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry?" Now, David was an ancient king of Israel that everyone looked up to, respected. Stories were told about him. And so he's pointing to their own history. And there's this story in the Old Testament where David goes into the house of God and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests can eat. And he also gave some to his companions. David was on the run for his life. He was hungry, and he's not supposed to eat this bread. This bread is not for David and his companions. But they break the law because David abides by the spirit of the law, even though he doesn't abide by the letter of the law. And what Jesus is saying is, this is what my disciples have done. The Sabbath is a day that's about restoration. My disciples were hungry, and so they ate. They were abiding by the spirit of the law, even if they weren't abiding by the letter of the law. And then he goes a step further. Imagine being a first century Pharisee who believes that this teacher, this rabbi, is breaking the Sabbath, and then he says this. Jesus added, the Son of Man, that's the way of talking about himself, the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. The guy you just caught breaking the law because you appealed to the letter of the law as found in the Old Testament and in the rabbinical writings. You're just like, we caught you. Look at you doing that. And he says, actually, we're abiding by the spirit of the law, even though it's not the letter of the law. And anyway, it doesn't matter because if you want to know what the law is all about, look right here. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And they loved that. They hated it. In fact, just a few verses later, they want to kill him. Blasphemy, heresy. But Jesus is very importantly redefining what Sabbath is in these passages by placing himself as the Lord of the Sabbath. Because what he's saying, and he very explicitly says this later in Matthew chapter 11, what he's saying is that if you want rest, rest is found in Jesus. Real rest for your soul. See, Jesus gave his life on a cross and rose from the dead. And when he did that, the scriptures teach us that all of the shortcomings in our life, all the sin, the brokenness that we have, he took all of that on himself. And in exchange for our sin and brokenness and shortcomings, he traded us his holiness. We couldn't possibly accomplish. We couldn't possibly succeed. We all have mess ups. It never feels like enough for us. And so Jesus did what we couldn't do. He lived a perfect life. And then in giving that life on the cross and in breaking the bonds of death by raising from the dead, he gave to us the life we couldn't live. So that when the Father looks at us, he doesn't see our shortcomings and our failures and our sin. He sees the goodness, the perfection, the holiness, the accomplishments of Jesus, which means there's nothing better than that you could accomplish, no matter how much you made or earned or what difference in the world you made. So you can rest in Christ because there's nothing left for you to do to prove your worth. God just gives it to you. That's the beauty of what Jesus does. And see, if we don't get this in our minds and in our hearts, if we don't really drive this down, we spend our whole life trying to prove ourselves. You can go on vacation. You can take a 2-week vacation to Hawaii. You could go on a cruise through the Greek Isles for 3 weeks at a time and never check your work email. And you won't find the rest you're looking for. Because if you don't see your value as being infinite, just because of what Jesus did and how much he loves you, there will be a part of you that is gnawing away on the inside, still trying to figure out how you're going to prove it, how you're going to show everybody that you're worth it, how you're going to earn it. It'll just be there, bubbling away in the background. Always feeling like, I'm not quite doing enough. I'm not quite earning it today. Oh, when these 3 weeks are over, I'm going to have so much power. I've got to go. True rest is only found in Jesus Christ. And this is true. It goes all the way back to the Genesis story. Genesis chapter 1 is this epic poem about how God created the universe. At the end of that poem, there's the sixth and final day of creation where God looks at what he has done. And it says this: God looked over all he'd made and he saw that it was very good. These other days of creation in this poem, God says, it's good. But after the sixth day, when all the work is done, he looks at it and goes like, it's very good. It's really, really good. And evening passed and morning came, marking the sixth day. So the creation of the heavens and the earth was everything in them completed. And he goes on the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation, his work which was very good. So he rested from all of his work. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy because it was the day when he rested from all of his work of creation. And his work of creation was very good. We're up to like 7 or 8 people who are catching on now. This is going great. Look, I want you to know, I love you guys a lot more than the 10 o'clock hour. And don't tell them I said that. And I certainly didn't tell them I loved them more than 8:30. Don't worry about any of that, but a little participation would be helpful. So God rested from all of his work of creation because his work was? I love you even more now. I'm just kidding. That was an accomplishment you just did, and that's not why I love you. You have infinite value without accomplishing. Okay. Why is this important? Because we can't really rest until we're satisfied. Otherwise, we're always thinking about the thing that's left undone. Pastor Tim Keller said it this way: the definition of resting is to be utterly satisfied with what's been done. And here's the secret to this. As long as the thing that's been done is something you did, you will never be utterly satisfied. It's a cliche as old as the print media, but in interview after interview over the years with celebrities and the wealthiest people in the world, you will read the same story over and over and over again. I thought when I got that Best Actor award, I'd finally be happy, but it lasted a day, and it was on to the next project. I thought after I made my first million, I would finally be happy. You know what? Probably in the next decade or two, we're gonna have somebody in the world that's worth $1 trillion. And you know what? They still won't be satisfied. Because we're insatiable when we're basing our value on what we've accomplished, on what we've done. And the definition of resting is to be utterly satisfied with what's been done, which means that Sabbath is about refusing to prove ourselves, because through Jesus Christ, we have nothing left to prove. Sabbath is about being satisfied with what's been done, not what we've done, but with what God's done, because what we've done will never fully satisfy, but what he's done has. So when we think about Sabbath, when we think about setting aside time with the Lord, time that's a day dedicated to him, time that's restful, there's all kinds of tips and tricks to doing this. I'm going to give you some books in just a few minutes, but what you got to know is that this is the foundation for all of it. If you don't understand that your value and worth is found in the work of Jesus and not in your own work, then no matter how many tips or tricks I give you, you're never going to figure out how to actually rest and unplug, because you will always on the inside have that gnawing feeling that you need to be doing something to earn it. Now, once you've got this down and you start to understand it, I just want to name, it takes work to Sabbath. You have to be intentional about the time that you take off. You have to actually set aside time. And look, I don't want to be overly legalistic about this, but there are steps that have to be taken in order for you to rest well, for you to Sabbath well, for you to vacation well. There are steps that have to be taken. I love this article by Judith Shulevitz in the New York Times a few years ago called Bring Back the Sabbath. She grew up in a Jewish household, but hadn't really found her Jewish faith to be that helpful for her. And so she got a little bit older, and then she came back because she found her life unfulfilling, and she found significance and help in the Sabbath. And she says this: most people mistakenly believe that all you have to do to stop working is not work. The inventors of the Sabbath understood that it was a much more complicated undertaking. You cannot downshift casually and easily, right? If you're going 1,000 miles an hour, 6 days a week, you're not going to drift into the weekend. You got to downshift. It takes intentionality. This is why the Puritan and Jewish Sabbaths were so exactingly intentional. The rules didn't exist to torture the faithful. They were meant to communicate the insight that interrupting the ceaseless round of striving requires a surprisingly strenuous act of will, one that has to be bolstered by habit as well as by social sanction. You want to actually unplug, you want to actually rest, you want to actually take helpful vacation, you need to first of all know that your worth and value is found in Christ alone. And then secondly, you have to do some very practical things. You need to let your team know that they're not supposed to contact you, that you're not checking messages, that you're not going to be ruled by everything that pops up on your phone. Sometimes you may have to turn the phone off. Sometimes you may have to throw your phone in the ocean. There are all kinds of things you may have to do if you want to start taking this seriously, but it will require work. And I got to tell you, there's a pastor friend of mine, he's retired now, but he started really taking his vacation time with his family very seriously because he said to himself, I have to remember that I am not the church that I pastor, and the church I pastor is not me. My own soul needs that on an annual basis. So every summer he would take several weeks off. And he would tell his staff, do not call me unless it is like a life or death situation. And if his staff ever called him, he would pick up the phone and he would say, choose your next words carefully, because your value to me will be determined by how much help you need with the thing I told you not to call about. And a lot of times they would say, Hope you have a great vacation. See you when you're back. Click. Just letting people know, look, I take this seriously. You will have to take it seriously if you want to actually rest. You'll have to plan. You'll have to let others know. You'll have to have like a game plan. You don't downshift without intentionality. Look, there's all kinds of books you can purchase to help you understand how to do some of this best. Take a photo of this if you want to. I'm not going to go through each of these. We just don't have time. But The Common Rule by Justin Earley is great. Rest, I quoted this one earlier by Alex Sujong Kimpeng. 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, an excellent book. You have 4,000 weeks of life basically before you die. So with that depressing thought, we'll move on. Deep Work, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World by Cal Newport. Actually, anything Cal Newport writes is worth you checking out. He's really helpful in putting your effort into the right things and not into everything. That's actually kind of counterproductive. So these are some great books to get you started, but my goal today wasn't to just give you lots of tips and tricks on how to take time off and how to rest, because the thing is, all the time off in the world won't give you rest as long as you derive your value from success. My goal today is to help you break the stranglehold that success and achievement might have in your life. Look, I'm not saying to be lazy. Please, by no means am I saying that. I'm saying burn bright. I think Christians ought to be some of the best employees, the best employers, the most creative musicians and filmmakers. Now, I think Christians ought to be the best of the best, but we also have to learn that success for us, Jesus called us to greatness, but greatness for us might look different than it does for the culture around us, because there are other things that we're going to prioritize, and we are never going to judge our own worth by what we produce. So burn bright. Burn bright, but don't burn out. And please, 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 please also don't refuse to burn. Gen Z, those of you who are like 30-ish, a little bit younger than 30. I'm going to say some things that are going to upset you for a second, but I'm on your side, so give me a second to get through that, and then I'll be right back with you, okay? So over the last several months, I've noticed like a lot of articles being written in magazines like The Economist and Business Insider and Finance Magazine about Gen Z. And what they're saying about you is that you are the period, worst period, generation period, ever period. And as an older millennial, I got to tell you, I'm so excited that we've passed the torch to you now. They ragged on us for a decade, man, 10, 15 years, and I was sick of it. But now you're worse than us. That's so good. The truth is, you're not the worst generation ever, and you're not lazy, and you're not overly cynical. You're young. You're young, and you've inherited a world that, because of the generations that went on before you, is kind of messed up. Mostly we blame the baby boomers, because I'm not in that generation either. But I'm in my 40s now, and I take plenty of responsibility for the way that the world is. Gen Z. Sorry that we allowed hustle culture to warp our understanding of what it looked like to work and to rest. Sorry you're inheriting a world that's addicted to success and achievement and money. My hope is that you'll do better, that you'll learn from our mistakes, and that you'll learn to live in the tension between burning bright. You should work hard. Some of you guys are so creative and talented. We got a couple Gen Z folks on our staff. You guys blow my mind with how creative you are. So I hope you burn bright. Hope you give us the best you got. But I hope you learn from us and you don't burn out. Find that healthy tension, and is a tension there. Timothy Keller, pastor, has been so helpful to me. When he first moved to New York City to plant a church, to start a church there, he made a deal with his wife, Kathy, that he would work really hard for 3 years. All of us have seasons where we got to burn the midnight oil, and we just got to go. There's seasons for that. If you can't become a doctor without doing a residency, which means 3 years of your life are just gone. It's really hard. But you got to figure out a way to downshift when that season is over. So he talked to his wife. He's like, 3 years, we're going to burn the midnight oil. I'm going to be going a lot. You're going to have to pick up more responsibility if we do this, but we'll do it together, and then after that, I'll downshift. And so she agreed to it. They moved to New York City. They started a church. It would end up coming over the next several decades, one of the most influential churches in the entire world. Tim Keller, really, really, such congruency between what he preached and how he lived. So thankful for him. 3 years came around, though, and he didn't downshift. 3.5 years, 4 years, 4.5 years, 5 years. He did not downshift. One day he comes home after another long night out, and Kathy is out on the balcony of their apartment, and she's got a stack of their fine china that was given to them as wedding gifts. And she's pulling out saucers out of this china, and she's taking a hammer, and she is just crashing all of these saucers, just breaking them up and scooting them off. And he just comes out and says, whoa, 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 what's going on, what's going on? She said, well, you made a promise to me that 3 years in, you would downshift, and you haven't, and we're at 5 years now. And so I'm just taking a hammer to these dishes that have served as a symbol of the commitment we're supposed to have with one another. Hit him like a ton of bricks. He apologized. And he changed things. Apology doesn't mean a lot without changed behavior. So over the coming months, he started delegating more things. He stopped believing he had to be at everything. And he started giving more time to his family and to his God and to his rest. More belief that his worth wasn't predicated on his output. They were sitting at dinner a few months later and talking about the changes, and he was telling her that he was grateful for her. And he said, it means the world to me that you'd be willing to lose some of those dishes I know you loved because you wanted to send a clear message to me. He said, I'm sure you were very, very upset about breaking those saucers. She said, actually, Tim, I only broke the saucers that matched the cups that we'd already broken, and so it really wasn't a big deal at all. That's mean, man. But she helped him realize that his worth wasn't dependent on output, and his rest and his time with family was more important. That the God who says he's already of infinite worth was the one who should rule and reign in his heart and his life and the way that he spent his time. A few years ago, my wife had been in bedside nursing for about a decade, and she moved into some management positions within the hospital, and she started making a lot more money. And I told her early on, I said, hey, baby, I just want you to know that I am not one of those men who will be threatened if you start making a lot more than me, okay? You just go for it. You be you. And so year after year, she was getting pay bumps and raises and getting accelerated into greater positions. But this last year, she took a new job, and 7-8 months in, she was having to be gone a lot into the evenings. It was a decision we made together. We make these decisions together. And it just wasn't working for our family. She was tired all the time. I felt like I was, working here full time and then also being like one of the only parents home for most of the time that the kids were awake. And it was just not working. And so we started talking a few months ago about making a change and praying through that and talking to family and friends about that. And just a couple of weeks ago, she took a very different job in a very different sector for a very different amount of money. And by different, I mean worse. The luxury of our life over the last month has declined considerably. The quality of our life over this last month has increased exponentially. Money's good. Success, achievement. These things are good things, but don't make them ultimate things. God should be our ultimate. He has our heart, and we find our rest in him when we understand that our value is predicated not on what we achieve, but on who he says we are. You're a child of God, his daughter, his son. Don't let the culture we live in make you forget it. I want to speak the words of Jesus over you this morning. So what I'd ask is for you to imagine him saying them to you. So if you would just close your eyes right where you are, just close your eyes. And just imagine Jesus speaking to you, the words from Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 and following. I'm just going to speak them over. Just imagine Jesus looking you right in the face and speaking these words to you. And here's the words he says in that chapter. Come to me, all you who are weary and overburdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Invite me into your heart. For I am humble and gentle of heart, and you will find rest for your soul. For my burden is easy to bear. My yoke is light. Father, thank you for Christ. Thank you for his goodness. Thank you, Lord, that we are not valued on our output, but on our identity. And thank you that our identity, for those of us who've received your free gift of Christ's death and resurrection, our identity is of infinite value because you loved us so. I pray for all those who are weary and overburdened this morning, that they might find rest in Jesus, that they might find rest in Sabbath, and that they might reprioritize their lives, not around achievement and success or money, those things are good, but around the goodness of God. It's in Jesus' name I pray.